Lords and ladies, the time is finally upon us for my Avowed review. Although it's not going to be a conventional review, and I'll get into that in a bit. I have over 80 hours clocked into the game, I've beaten the game, and I have a fair bit to say, but like I said, this is not going to be a conventional review, because although I thought initially, in terms of my review, I was going to do the usual bullet points of positives and negatives, which I might still do to varying degrees, I think Avowed is very much a special case of a game, and that's both positive and negative, although overall I'd say it's more negative than positive, because Avowed, really, it's a game that requires that you've played previous games to enjoy it. By this I mean that if you were to play Avowed and simply jump into the game, never having played the two isometric games that preceded this game, i.e. Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, you're probably not going to get the story, you're probably not going to care about the story, and the game will come off as incredibly bland and boring for the most part. It will be a generic fantasy game, and the worst thing about it is you'll have no reason to care. Now, that's true of a lot of generic fantasy games, but Avowed really is a special case, because I truly believe that Avowed is a good game under a lot of caveats and preconditions, which is to say, if you really, really like the Pillars of Eternity universe, which I do, Aora. In fact, it might be my favorite universe ever created in fiction in terms of games, then you're going to be automatically interested in the story. Because for better or worse, since we don't have a Pillars of Eternity 3, Avowed serves as a Pillars of Eternity 2.5, if you will. And the game is simply chock-a-block filled with references to the Pillars of Eternity universe, Aora. It is filled with references to characters, to the cosmology, the metaphysics, the structure of the world, the many different races, the politics, the history. And that's all well and good, and I absolutely love that about Avowed. It's why I actually like the game a lot. I haven't had this much fun playing a game in a long time, personally, and we'll get into that in a bit. But if you don't know anything about that stuff, then rationally, and I have to be honest here, because we all have our biases. I have my biases, obviously, I'm a human being. And especially as gamers, we have our biases. I know I like Avowed because I love the Pillars of Eternity universe. I don't like Avowed because on its own as a game, it's a fantastic game. On its own, Avowed is kind of an average or okay game. It has some highlights here and there, and has a lot of negatives as well. And I have to acknowledge those negatives, despite the fact that I like the game a lot, because, well, I love Pillars of Eternity, and I love the universe of Aora. Think about it this way. Take a random series of fantasy novels, maybe a trilogy, maybe something else, and you decide to jump in at the deep end at novel 3, in a series of maybe 3 or 4 novels, right? You might get things still, because the book has a glossary, and yes, Avowed has a kind of glossary in dialogue. When you're talking to people, you can highlight things, it explains what is what and who is who. But are you really going to get the entire story, never having read the first 2 books that preceded the 3rd book? Will you care about the characters? Will you care about the plot? Will you care about the world itself? Yes, it's possible, but it's very unlikely at the end of the day. And that analogy holds very true for Avowed. It's possible that you might still like the game. It's possible that you might still like the story, but it's very unlikely. Because here's another thing about Avowed, and in general the Pillars of Eternity universe. It's very read-heavy, it's very lore-heavy, there's a lot of lore dumping, and it's fairly complex, there's a lot going on. And the universe itself, and this is one of the reasons why I love the universe so much, is quite different and distinct from most fantasy universes. The time period is different, because the universe of Avowed, in terms of its time period, as an analog to our own, takes place during the early modern period, perhaps the Renaissance period, roughly between 1500 and 1600. This is why you have early forms of firearms. This is why the dress and attire looks the way it does. It's not a medieval fantasy setting. It's a Renaissance, early modern setting. That by itself makes it different. And then you have further analogs for our world, such as the interest in animancy, which is the science of souls. Admittedly, we don't have a science of souls, true, in our world, but the idea being this newfound passion and zeal for science that, again, has its analog in our world in terms of, say, the 17th century, with people such as Isaac Newton, Leibniz, and Galileo, a time of discovery, if you will. So the setting itself is different. And there's so many things about Eora that just make it very, very distinct from your conventional fantasy setting. And without having played the previous games, and I do say previous games because Avowed has been marketed as a game that is separate from Pillars of Eternity, that you can play and jump into, I just don't think you're going to care about the world and the universe. I happen to care a lot about the universe of Avowed, about Eora, about the details, the science of souls, animancy, the gods, the races, the politics, the empires, the republic. That is my bread and butter. In fact, the original intention behind this channel, Spell&Shield, was to serve as an educational platform to the world of Eora, in anticipation of Avowed, because back then, I thought it was going to be a pretty big and hefty game. It turns out, of course, that it's not. And so you can check out some of my earliest videos. There's some very detailed videos about the lore of Eora in preparation for Avowed, to basically introduce you as a newcomer to the game. So with all these caveats, I say that Avowed is a good game if you really have a passion for the world of Eora, and have played the Pillars of Eternity games 1 and 2, and more importantly, actually care about those games and the content. Because there are people that have played those games that did not like them and did not enjoy those games. And in such a case, you'll probably also not enjoy Avowed. So, who is Avowed for? It's very odd. Avowed is for people who are fans of the Pillars of Eternity universe. And moreover, not even all of them. Set aside the people who played Pillars but didn't like it. Take into account the people who played Pillars, both 1 and 2, and enjoyed both of those games, but hate the very concept and idea of Avowed because it's not a CRPG and it's not isometric. Because, oddly enough, despite a lot of people's aversion and opposition to isometric CRPGs, there's some people that actually love them, and as such, they view Avowed and feel that Avowed is anathema to its predecessors in terms of 1 and 2. And yes, I personally would have preferred an isometric CRPG from Obsidian in the same vein as Pillars of Eternity 1 or 2. That is not what we got, but I still managed to enjoy Avowed. With all of that said, I really have my doubts that if you are not familiar with the Pillars of Eternity universe, if you don't like it, if you don't care about that universe, that you're going to enjoy Avowed. Because the story by itself doesn't make a whole lot of sense to anyone who's never played the Pillars games. Yes, it makes sense, as in, they lay it out decently well, they explain the terms, there's enough exposition such that you sort of understand what's going on, but it's insufficient. So, it's with a very heavy heart I have to say that Avowed is a very average game in most respects if you do not like Pillars, if you've never played Pillars and you don't care about Pillars. Now, once you say, I played the Pillars games, I like them or I love them, and I can't wait to have more of this universe, in that instance, in that situation, Avowed can be a very good game. But it's not without its flaws. So let's talk about the positives. And I'm very aware of my biases here, lords and ladies. As I've said, I am a huge fan of the Pillars universe. It's probably my favorite setting. I know this, and I know that's not for everyone, and I know it doesn't apply to everyone. So, that out of the way. Avowed does a few things very well. The exploration and the ability to explore, with parkouring, with climbing, with jumping around, is very well done and very well implemented. You can climb most things, it's a lot of fun, and the implementation of a sound effect in the background that allows you to know, oh, there's some treasure here, there's something I need to explore, helps facilitate that a great deal. And so, you can see a lighthouse, or a tall crumbling building, and there might be something very valuable there. There might be a unique treasure, there might be a unique weapon, or a unique ring, you never know. And so in this regard, Avowed really encourages you to explore, and the exploration is very enjoyable overall. Avowed is not an open world, but it has pretty large hubs, very large hubs that you can basically romp through to your heart's content, and you're probably going to discover a lot in the process. And I think that was very well implemented overall. Another thing about Avowed that I like is that the combat is pretty fun. I finished my first playthrough as a pure warrior, and I'm currently on my second playthrough as a more or less pure wizard, and both styles are quite enjoyable. I enjoy both of them. I'm probably going to do a third playthrough as a ranger type of character. In fact, although I have over 80 hours in the game, the first 20 hours was just experimentation for me, and I restarted the game twice, so I've experimented with all the playstyles. And so the combat is quite fun. It's not perfect, but for Obsidian, it's pretty fun. I enjoyed that as well. There's a lot of cool and unique loot. Loot has a history, which is explained when you pick it up. And again, that's a carryover from Pillars of Eternity. The weapons, the armor, etc., these all have histories, and it's explained to you when you pick it up, and I enjoy that aspect quite a bit. And I also overall like the enchanting system quite a bit, but again, it's lifted directly from Pillars of Eternity, where you have a unique, it has certain properties, and you can usually choose to enhance it in two different ways, go down two different paths. Now, in Avowed, that's only true of the weapons. The armor does not allow you to do that, whereas in the Pillars games you can. I'm not sure why they left that out, but I enjoy the enchanting system and the loot system overall. I think the companions overall are pretty good as well. Kai is my personal favorite and stands out the most, and it's not because he was the voice actor for Garrus. I think on his own, he's the character in the game that has the most interaction with the story, the most exposition, and the most reactivity to events in the story, even if they're relatively small. And Giata the Animancer is also a very interesting character that I enjoyed quite a bit, who has a lot of reactivity to the world and the events in the world from her own particular perspective. And Yahtzee, the Orlin character, is also fairly interesting. The only character that I thought was kind of bland is Marius, the Dwarven Ranger, but he's also not terrible, he's just okay. The writing definitely has some highlights, definitely not Obsidian's best work in terms of the writing department, but the writing varies from very good to average, so I would say overall the writing receives a good score, and again, given the background of Pillars, that elevates it quite a bit for me. But on its own, I think the writing is pretty good. Choice and consequence is very important in Avowed, and there is a lot of reactivity in terms of the game's endings, and during the game too. There are a lot of important decisions you may or may not be aware of, I won't spoil anything here, that if you don't take properly, something different will happen. This happened to me in the second part of the game. I forgot to take care of something, and we'll just put it this way, something very major happened. And even your many dialogues that you could say one of the main characters of the game absolutely has a massive impact on the outcome of how that other character ends up at the end of the game and what you decide to do. And it starts at the very beginning in terms of whether you're kind to this entity or not, whether or not you show anger to this entity, whether or not you show frustration or understanding. That all has a lot of reactivity and consequence, and I think that aspect is really well done. What about the cons? I've listed out the pros. Well, there are a bunch of cons, unfortunately, as well. One of the biggest cons is a classic with Obsidian is they do not know how to make a character creator. And overall, the character designs are average to painfully bad or terrible. The character creator is very limited, and unfortunately, Obsidian has not mastered the art of making convincing faces for humans and similar races such as dwarves and elves. They all have that zombie-esque, dead-eyed look to them. The faces are very plasticky and smooth, and so they lack texture. And the only exception here are the Amawa, who are a seafaring race with scales. That's Kai, basically, the blue guy, who looks pretty good, I think. And the Orlins, the so-called furries of the universe. They're not furries, but they're basically hairy hobbits or hairy halflings, and they look pretty good overall. But in terms of the elves, the humans, and dwarves, most of them look painfully average to terribly bad. And I'm sorry, that takes away from the enjoyment of the game, even if it is set in the Pillars universe, which I love. The character creator is quite limited to bad, and the character models are average to bad, and frankly speaking, that takes away from the enjoyment of the game, because I personally assign a lot of value to aesthetics in the game. And the aesthetics are just lacking here. For whatever reason, Obsidian is not capable of making good-looking, convincing character models. They probably should take a note or two from Larian in this regard. So the characters do not look good, and some of them are downright ugly. On top of that, you have the usual uglification of the female characters and figures. Very few of them look especially feminine, and that of course is a huge no-no for me as well. But that's obviously very typical in Western games, so to be expected, I guess. Another negative of the game is there's not a lot of enemy variety, and they need to go into some details here, but basically, the enemies tend to repeat themselves. There's a fixed set of enemies that you will encounter again and again and again, with a few exceptions, albeit in different iterations. So for example, there are beetle enemies, but they come in 3 or 4 different iterations with different types of attacks and what have you. And that can make the combat a bit boring because of the repetition. And to be fair, a lot of the repetition comes from Pillars of Eternity. It's just that in Pillars of Eternity, it doesn't feel like the enemies are the same over and over and over, because it's an isometric RPG, and the variety is not simply found in the visuals and the specific types, but the subtypes. So for example, in the Pillars universe, you might fight druid enemies who are humanoid, but they're going to be using druidic magic, nature magic against you. There's nothing like that in Avowed. In Avowed, you basically fight wizards, warriors and priests, and rangers who shoot you with arrows at range over and over and over again. Even in terms of the undead you fight, who have a lot of repetition too. It's the same undead again and again and again. And overall, that takes away from the fun factor in combat, because wherever you go, you know you fought these enemies before, over and over and over, and that definitely makes the combat less fun. Getting back to the writing, as I mentioned earlier, has some real hit or miss moments. Towards the end, for example, as we are moving towards the climax of the game, the finale, things tend to speed up quite a bit, and the writing almost becomes too dramatic or heavy-handed, and so the pace of the writing is lost because I don't feel that the pace of the writing accords well with the events in the game that has hitherto preceded that pacing, so to speak. And so it really wraps up quickly in terms of story, in terms of the writing, in terms of the reactivity, even in terms of the emotionality, and I feel it was done a bit too soon. And I feel that the pacing here was lacking, because the pacing does not accord with the feeling that the game has instilled with you up until that point. And that was a real weakness. Yes, the writing has some very strong highlights here and there, but my biggest criticism is the pacing, especially towards the last 15 or 10% of the game, which can really make or break a story. Things draw to a close way too rapidly, in my opinion, and the writing is not particularly well done in that regard. I think this is a mistake on Obsidian's part, and I'm not sure if Microsoft pushed them to do it, but this game was originally marketed as a so-called Skyrim killer. 4 or 5 years ago, I bought into that too, but within the last 3 years or so, it quickly became clear to me that that's not the case. And it's unfortunate that this game was marketed in this way, as this pseudo-open world that you can do everything in, even though it's definitely not that, because people with no background, again, with the Pillars of Eternity universe, look at this game and think, oh, this is like Skyrim, oh, this is like Obsidian. In fact, there are already detailed videos comparing Oblivion, a game released in 2006, and Skyrim, a game released in 2011, one-to-one, frame by frame, in most regards, to Avowed. Which is a shame, because Avowed really fails in this regard. Avowed is not a super interactive world in terms of objects. You do not move, you cannot steal cheese wheels and plates from tables, you cannot shoot arrows into the air with them dropping down. It doesn't work that way. Does it make the game terrible? No. But it definitely takes away from the charm of the game. The cities themselves, or the settlements, although they look, architecturally speaking, quite aesthetic and impressive, do not have a very lively feel to them. There's no hustling and bustling of the NPCs. They don't move around, they don't have schedules, they just stand there, and that's a huge negative in this game. And because of the early marketing that has been compared to Skyrim or Oblivion, and Avowed really fails in this regard, it makes the world a lot less believable. And overall, I don't think Avowed should have been made in this format. They should have stuck to a CRPG isometric formula. And at the end of the day, I don't think Obsidian should have made this game in this particular format and presentation. They should have stuck to an isometric format and presentation, a classical CRPG, because yes, Avowed is incredibly niche, and it's not going to appeal to everyone, and so in my opinion, it would have been better if they just stuck with a tried and true formula and marketed the game to the niche audience that it has cultivated over the years, as opposed to a broad audience that this game was never going to appeal to begin with. Oh yes, and there's no romance in the game, which for me is not a negative. I've grown to really hate romances in games because it tends to be such a cheap gimmick, and it tends to not enhance the story, and sometimes it's just flat out bad. And so I don't give a rat's buttocks about romance, and I'm happy it's not in the game. but for a lot of people who are obsessed with smooching and copulating with pixels, this will be disappointing to them. Overall, Avowed is a very niche game, and I stand by my words. If you haven't played Pillars, if you don't care about Pillars, and you actively dislike the Pillars universe, Avowed is definitely not for you. On its own, the game simply does not stand up to scrutiny. I cannot recommend this game, and I should mention one thing, a technical issue about the game that is absolutely game-breaking, and that is the constant crashing to desktop. I don't normally have technical issues. This game must have crashed a dozen or 30 times for me. They released a patch that supposedly was supposed to help with this, and the game still crashed to desktop multiple times. That is not acceptable. That is a terrible game-breaking technical issue, and they should have never released a game in that condition. Overall, do I recommend Avowed? Yes, if you are a heavy, hardcore Pillars fan, then you will like the story a lot. It is super deep on the lore. It is super Pillars. But, as I've said multiple times already, if you don't know Pillars, if you don't care about Pillars, this game is not going to be for you. It's going to be painfully average. It has some highlights, it has a lot of negatives, and in that sense I can't really recommend the game. What I might say is, wait for a very deep sale on Steam, pick it up when it's maybe 50, 60, 70, even 80% off, give it a go. But with the current pricing, with everything I've said, I cannot recommend this game to the average person, because to them, without the Pillars background, without the Pillars interest, Avowed is going to come off as bland, boring, and hyper-generic, and the game will not keep your interest over the long haul. So that's all very unfortunate. Avowed over the last couple of years was my most anticipated game that did not deliver on all the goods, although for me, it has been very enjoyable because of my interest and commitment to the Pillars setting, and that needs to be said. This game should have been kept niche to that specific audience, because that's who this game was made for. It is not made for the general, broader public, even for people who broadly enjoy fantasy RPGs. It's not made for them either, because the world is so different, and it's very difficult to care about the world and the events in the game if you're jumping in at the deep end, starting with Avowed, as opposed to Pillars 1 and 2. With that said, that's the end of my review. I cannot recommend Avowed unless you love Pillars of Eternity as a setting, and best case scenario, wait for a deep sale either on GOG or Steam to buy this game, or play it on Game Pass, like I believe Microsoft intended it to be because of the pricing. But in any event, if you like my videos and you like my takes, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. It's much appreciated, as it really helps out the channel. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.